It's interesting to think about the disproportionate risk that people with disability experience in emergency situations, because quite often many people with disabilities have additional or extra support needs that they need to plan for, plan around, and accommodate during a response in an emergency situation. Now, one of the big challenges for people with disability is they haven't been part of the conversation at all. So they haven't been part of pre-planning for disasters. When you're not part of pre-planning for emergencies, then it means you're not prepared to respond. So all those additional support needs become a significant risk for people. One of the things that is probably a good example of what this looks like for people is not planning for the people who usually help you to, say, manage your equipment or manage your personal care and support needs. We all know when a disaster strikes, it strikes the whole community, and the people who provide us with those supports live and work in the same community. So they're impacted by the same disaster event. People with disability will then become quickly separated from the people they typically rely on. So the whole situation, I think, of having higher demands in an emergency situation and fewer opportunities to manage those supports puts people in quite a tricky situation when disasters strike. And so what we've been trying to do is get people to flip their thinking from that vulnerability perspective into a capability approach to thinking. So if we can start to think about what are people capable of doing, how do they organize the supports that they need, who needs to support them, then I think our disaster recovery workers can start to think about people with disability more in terms of what are the supports, who provides those supports, where are those supports compromised in an emergency situation, and then how can we bridge the gap? I think that's a much more productive conversation than thinking about the risks and the vulnerabilities that people with disability face. When we talk with people with disability, they will say, nobody checked on me. So that's a really common phrase that people with disability will give, nobody checked on me. And lots of people will go for long periods of time, not being checked on, but at the same time, not reaching out. So I think the number one thing that recovery committees can do is reach out. That might mean reaching out through community and disability services that are in their local community, and they know and trust and have good relationships with the people that they support. So if you can access those key service providers in the community to support that kind of outreach, then you'll be doing the number one thing that people with disability need: someone to check on them, to make sure that they're okay, and of course, to be able to respond in the event that they're not okay. This whole problem that comes from not pre-planning for disability is a bit of a vicious cycle, and we can actually stop that cycle in the recovery phase by taking stock after an event happens. So even if people with disability hadn't been pre-planned for, we can take that moment to think about what was the impact of this disaster on people with disability in our community. What could we have done differently in the situation? At that moment, invite people with disability to the table to talk about the impact for them. It does a really important thing for the disability community. It means they're heard, their voice is valued and understood, and it starts that conversation where they're part of the pre-planning for the next time a disaster strikes. But what we really need to be doing, and the number one difference we can all make, is actually inviting disability representation to have that direct conversation. Only people with disability can tell you about their support needs as well as their strengths and capabilities. And they're the only ones who can tell you about the best ways to organize that support. Services can tell you about the impact of disasters on the provision of that support to people with disability in the communities. So I think the number one change that can happen is by reaching out to disability representative organizations. We can be proud of the situation in Australia and how it's progressed over the last 5 to 7 years. It's not to say we don't have a long way to go. And I think what we need to make sure now is that we're reaching out to all communities across all of Australia and making sure that every single person with a disability has access to preparedness information, is thought about during the planning and disaster recovery process, because we know that disasters can strike anywhere, but there's still far more people who need to learn about person-centered emergency preparedness, inclusive emergency management planning, and that needs to reach all council areas across all of Australia.